Welcome to Climate Quickies, bite-sized nuggets of climate goodness from our TEDxLondon experts in under 5 minutes.
In this week's Quickie, we speak to Justin Worland, senior correspondent at Time magazine covering climate change. He shares what it's like to be a climate journalist, the most impactful stories he's covered, and some of the dangers involved in this sort of work. Let's head over to Justin to tell us more. Stay curious.
My name is Justin Worland. I'm a climate journalist at Time magazine. I write about climate change and basically how it shapes our world. The role of a climate journalist is like any other journalist in the sense that we're trying to inform the world on the topic that we cover, in this case, climate change and the urgent crisis that we face. Climate journalists are, depending on who you are, digging through reports, talking to people who are facing severe environmental challenges, talking to policymakers, talking to activists, really trying to piece together all the pieces of the climate story and tell them in a way that the public can understand and hopefully will use that information to, engage with policymakers, to be involved themselves in figuring out how we tackle climate change. I have the luxury of being able to cover a really diverse range of stories. Some of the ones that I think are most impactful are ones where I go into a community, tell a story that maybe hasn't really been told, something that's really, influencing people on the ground and just hasn't been picked up by national media. So that's one kind. The other thing is really finding ways to explain really important things like, say, big legislation or big global policy moves, and finding ways to tell those stories in a way that the average person can understand. So I think impact can come in lots of different ways. I think about sort of those two buckets, on the ground stories, and then just explaining really big things to everyday people. I love to get out on the road to talk to people, to see what's happening in communities. And I think there's really like a diverse array of stories that haven't been told. It's striking. I spent time earlier this year in San Diego, which is, a big American city, looking at a $100+ billion plan to revamp their transportation system that really hadn't gotten much coverage, but was about to reshape the lives of people on the ground. And I found that, when I thoughtfully wrote about that, there was a huge amount of engagement, funny enough, from people in San Diego who just hadn't seen that coverage really in their local media. The other really important thing to me is finding stories from people of color, groups, people who are live in poverty, stories that haven't been told because people are just sidelined, and finding ways to elevate those stories. And so I was in Alabama, I guess 2 months ago, talking to people in a community that have sanitation issues where basically whenever it rains, and it's raining more there, their pipes back up and they have to deal with sanitation basically issues inside their homes. So really finding any way to get into community, talk about things that people aren't talking about, and elevate those stories is important to my work. There's this big debate about what kind of stories are the best climate stories. And really, my experience has been that good stories are the best climate stories, that people are actually engaged and interested in anything, if you can find the right way to tell that story, right? So it's not that they're bored by policy. It's not that they want to be scared or they're afraid of being scared. All of these stories have value, and they're all true. You just have to find the right way to tell them. And so, I go back always to this example from 2019 when I wrote a story about a border carbon adjustment, literally the most boring sounding thing possible. And it was our second most read climate story of the year. A ton of people read it. It's all about finding an interesting way to tell it. There's a range of challenges that a climate journalist might face. I mean, first off, journalism is a really challenging industry. It's a challenging industry to get people to pay attention. It's a challenging industry to navigate various media outlets and demands. It's challenging to communicate on climate specifically because climate is something that isn't inherently grabby for people. So that's a big challenge. I'll say I personally haven't experienced too much of this, but for a lot of climate journalists, particularly in the global south, in places like the Amazon, where they're trying to unearth stories about wrongdoing, there is a threat to life and well-being, and so the gamut runs really from the more quotidian challenges of communication to the really life-threatening challenges of trying to do your job. First thing I would say to anybody who's interested in getting involved in climate journalism is to do the craft, right? To be a journalist. So if you find ways to write stories, get them published, that's the first thing that you need to do. Especially if you're going to be a written word journalist. And then of course to learn, to be curious, to have this sort of information in your back pocket that's going to inform the work that you would do. I think that's always going to be an asset as a journalist. Be curious and be informed.
Thanks for listening to this Quickie.
This episode was created by our superstar podcast team at TEDxLondon and supported by our headline partner, the global bank, Citi. Until next time,
stay curious.